I'm gonna record.
Good morning, folks. I'll just let everybody trickle in. It's just after 8:30. It's a Tuesday morning. It's 2022. Okay, we're going to get going because I know this hour is going to go fast. I will say good morning again. I'm Frank Simons. I'm serve as the Associate Dean for Research in the college, and I'm glad everyone is here. It's an early morning start, so if you haven't, coffeeed up, get your caffeine or whatever it is that gets you going. This is the U's Research Ethics Week. So welcome to that. And if you're not familiar with it, this is an annual week that the Office for Vice President of Research organizes a number of activities that are both centralized. There's a symposium for a half day tomorrow. I'll put it in the chat if you're not familiar with it, on deepening engagement and equity in research. And there's a panel session there. And then the expectation from OVPR is collegiate units also roll out an activity or event during this week. And so this is CEHD's version, and our title today is Authentic Research Partnerships, Pathways to Deepening Engagement and Equity. And in putting this together, there's a lot of opportunity in this college. It's part of the fabric of what makes up CEHD. Its commitment to ethical conduct, ethical inquiry, ethical research is a cornerstone of what we do. And I'm just delighted. I'll be very quick because I'll get out of the way. We're joined today by Ann Masten and Amy Hewitt. We're going to do, here's the structure, and I'll introduce both of them very, very briefly. The structure is 2 talks, 20 minutes, approximately 20 minutes each. Amy will go first, and then 10 minutes for Q&A. And then Ann has 20 minutes roughly, and then 10 minutes for Q&A. If you're willing and able, and that Q&A, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll try to do live dialogue. It's okay to put a question in the chat box, but if possible, we can make this a conversation after the presentation. So just briefly, Ann Masten, for those of you who don't know, Ann is a longtime distinguished professor in Institute for Child Development, the College of Ed and Human Development, has a number of titles, as you might expect. She's a Regents Professor, the Irving B. Harris Child Development Professor, Distinguished McKnight Professor, and is a long-standing program of research in deep community partnerships with regard to highly mobile and homeless youth and resilience. Amy Hewitt, as many of you know, is a professor in organizational leadership policy development and is also the director of the Institute for Community Integration, which is a designated college-wide research center that is a very active, long-standing, deeply committed, deeply engaged in community, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, with regard to disability and policy. And so we have these 2 individuals who are going to lead us through 2 discussions on deepening engagement and pathways to equitable engagement and research. So with that, Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Frank. And I'm going to quickly share my screen and we'll get going. When Ellen and Frank asked Ann and I to do this today, 1, thank you for inviting us. And then 2, I sort of planned the bigger picture, like looking institute-wide at ICI, what we do to support and promote and use community engagement in all of our work. And then Ann's going to take a very specific project look. So I think that sets the framework well. As I was thinking about preparing for this, in addition to knowing I was going to be looking across our institute in various ways that we promote community engagement, these are kind of the key areas that I'm going to talk about today. One is just the right of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to participate. And our institute, as Frank said, is very focused on disability policy, disability practices, and trying to conduct applied research that's going to improve the inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in their family life, in school, in our communities, and every aspect of our community, whether that be employment or faith communities or the playground at a local park. So one key area for us is just recognizing that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a right to participate in research. Setting our research priorities is really something that we have to engage our community in from the very beginning. Our personnel is really key to, I think, some of our success around engagement. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that. We are a very large center. We cross the lifespan in terms of issues related to children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're soft money funded, so we have to secure the resources to do our research. And that often requires us to be a mixed method research. So figuring out strategies to optimize engagement, irrespective of the research method you're using, is something I'm going to talk about. Then the importance of building reciprocal relationships with both individuals in the community and organizations. And then another key aspect from our Institute's perspective is knowledge translation. So in the 20 minutes I have, I'm going to condense knowledge about those key topics. One of the key elements to being able to do research about individuals and with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, and organizations that support them is they have a right to participate in research. And often because of assumptions, bias, sometimes what feels like paternalism, and certainly ableism, often IRBs and persons who are reviewing applications actually make assumptions and make it difficult for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to participate. The consent process isn't always cognitively accessible. Sometimes things change. Right now, we're required to use something called the San Diego Brief Assessment of Capacity to Consent tool, which is kind of a screener. And by the very nature of that screening tool, if a person doesn't pass, it's assumed they can't participate in the research. But there are some concerns about that instrument. And then also, the person has a right then to have a substitute, such as a guardian or a proxy, answer questions or participate in the research, but it's not the same perspective. And so there's ongoing sort of tug and pull about the right to protect people from harm, but then also that sort of prohibits them or makes assumptions that persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities are incapable of making informed decisions. And that's really not true. So it's a tug and pull we play at the very beginning of all of our research around who our subjects are and if they are able to even participate. It also seems like there's this different kind of treating people in one group differently than others. The presumption that a person has a right, a basic human right to make informed decisions, is often taken away based on decisions made at an IRB level. And sometimes reviewers really lack a clear understanding of substitute decision-making laws that exist within states. Too often it's sort of there's a guardian or there's not a guardian, and we've come a long way in many states around various types of guardianship. There's in some states temporary and some emergency, there are guardian ad litems, there's adult guardianship, there's guardianship of an estate, various types of guardianship, and just making a decision based on a person's disability is reasonably limiting and a somewhat shallow perspective. And it does happen. I mean, we've literally encountered things with IRB where, well, you can do this study with children because they clearly have a guardian, but you can't do it with adults who have intellectual disability. That's a recent one. So there's this constant struggle we have around IRB and the ethics of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities participating in research And there is not a presumption that people are competent. When we say we're doing research on persons with intellectual and developmental disability, it's exactly the opposite. There's an assumption that they are not competent and couldn't make their own decision about whether or not they want to participate. Lots of barriers there. It ebbs and flows, and it depends on the makeup of an IRB. It depends on if we're where we're doing the work and what kind of research it is, but it's a fundamental challenge we face. In kind of addressing community engagement and that right of persons to participate in research, one of the things that I think really is helpful at ICI is who our personnel are. By intention, but then just also by happenstance, sometimes we actually hire a lot of people who have disabilities. We hire family members of persons with disabilities. So we have a lot of parents, a lot of siblings who work at ICI, and increasingly diversity with respect to linguistic background. And that, I think, really helps us in understanding the community need and where we can go for evolving relationships and developing community engagement. I should also just point out that our staff who have disabilities or who are family members are in various roles, from being PIs of many of our research centers to being project staff who work on research projects, but then also administrative staff and in other roles. I don't think I can underscore enough how influential working day to day with people who live the reality of persons with disabilities and their families makes in, one, us being able to achieve our mission, but two, to make sure that we're engaged with the right people in our communities regarding our research. So I also want to get into just some kind of specific things we do that I think from an institute-wide perspective promote engagement of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families in our research. So we have some formal processes and formal advisory groups that we staff, that we pull together, that we support, and we engage with them throughout any calendar year. We have something at ICI called our Community Advisory Council. It, by definition and by law, actually, our regulations that fund our University Center on Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, has to be made up primarily of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities or family members. And we use them in a formal way. We also have something called a self-advocacy advisory committee, which works it's all people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and they help us in a number of ways with respect to our research. And then depending on the project or the center, we may have a specialized advisory group around that. But all of ICI's research staff are able to engage with our Community Advisory Council and our Self-Advocacy Advisory Committee. So things that they help us with designing, implementing, and summarizing a community needs assessment. We do that every 5 years. We have to do that in partnership with the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, as well as our protection and advocacy system within Minnesota. And we use our Community Advisory Council as well as our Self-Advocacy Committee to help us figure out how we're going to do that from our university center perspective. We also do routine check-ins, conversations, meeting, informal gatherings to try to stay connected to these partners throughout the year. If we have a new RFP that we're looking at, so for example, right now we're looking at a research and training center on equity and diversity related to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We'll reach out first to our Community Advisory Council and our Self-Advocacy Committee to help us generate ideas. What are things of importance related to this guidance that you would like to see us engage in? I think another piece that's important for us is that in all of our work, we have partners that we work with. So subcontractors, currently we work with about 51 subcontractors. These are national organizations or state level organizations. A recent RFP is working with the ARC of Minnesota around some employment issues, and with Self Advocates of Minnesota, which is a statewide self-advocacy group. And then we have about 119 consultants. I didn't take the time to look at how many of those consultants are persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, but a great many of them are. In terms of optimizing our engagement across all methods, I mean, as I said, ICI is really a mixed methods organization. So when I think about that, there are meaningful ways that we work with our community partners at every single step. I already mentioned the idea generation. Sometimes we work with them on the research question development if we're just not quite sure how to respond to an RFP. We're reaching out to them and saying, here's the general area of our work. What are the important things? And they'll help us with that. And I don't know why my video just turned off. That's weird. Did you do that, Frank? Frank got new powers with Zoom this morning. Anyway, then we also turn to our community partners a lot to help us figure out where should we go to get access. And often they're helping us with our data collection tools. Sometimes they're helping us with data gathering. And then we have a big role of engaging our partners in understanding what the data is telling us, our key findings, and how to effectively communicate and share those findings. And all of that, I think, is just so central to intentionality to build reciprocal relationships. And, you know, we have some relationships that we've had for 30 years, and then we're constantly trying to build new ones. We have a person who about 75% of their role is in fostering, engaging new community partners. So part of that give and receive is, what do partners want and how can we mutually help one another? An assumption as a PI that I always make is that we will share resources, and not in a nominal minor way. In a very real way, we share the resources coming into us for our work with our community partners, and always operate on the assumption that any role that persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities have in our research will be compensated. And I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. One thing our center is well known for is knowledge translation. Very early on, we created something called Self-Advocacy Online, which is a place where individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities can go to hear stories from one another, to learn about new skills. But there's a section in Self-Advocacy Online that's called Research for All. And I'd say for 20 years, we've been taking our research and translating it, not the researchers. Our Self-Advocacy Advisory Committee meet with the PIs and the research staff to review and understand the findings, to create plain language materials around that. And then another key to our knowledge translation is really creating ways in which our findings can reach multiple audiences, which means multiple formats. Sometimes our audiences, do want a big long report or do care about an academic journal, but most of the time they don't. And so we have to figure out, how can we translate what we've learned in a way that's going to help our partners? Some colleagues of mine got some funding from PCORI to really try to understand this concept of engagement, true engagement of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in research. And here are some of the key lessons that they're getting ready to publish about this work. One is that an aspect for both individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families is sort of truth and reconciliation, and that acknowledging to people things that have happened that haven't been good, like past experiences, experiments that have hurt people with IDD, the biases that many researchers have toward people with IDD, and then acknowledging a history of policies and practices that have been oppressive and hurt and segregated people. And then really embracing that engagement really means nothing about us without us, which is a phrase that's commonly used by individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And being able to assign roles of persons with intellectual disability that are based on their strength and not making assumptions about what people can or can't do. And then always remembering that all research is done in a cultural context. With that, those are some of the things that we do well. There are a lot of things that we've got a lot of work to do at ICI that I think are really worth mentioning. One is we are striving hard at engaging more families and individuals with intellectual disabilities from diverse racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds, as well as new partnerships with organizations that support them, ensuring that all of our PIs are including research questions in their studies related to equity and diversity, and getting everyone to understand that the intersectionality of intellectual and developmental disabilities with racial, ethnic, and linguistic demographic measures are really important. Another big thing for us, there are virtually no national data sets in this country that adequately identify persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's a constant advocacy thing for us. And then increasing the diversity of our own staff related to racial and ethnic backgrounds, in addition to the disability and family members. And then just really trying to live that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. If diversity is not part of it, it's not inclusive. So we do a lot of advocacy work around that. And with that, I'll open it up for questions, and I think Frank is going to moderate that part.
Well, let's be clear. I failed to introduce Ellen Freeman to the group. Ellen, as many of you, maybe all of you know, is the director of the Office for Research and Policy for the college, and she is going to help moderate, and I'll help Ellen help moderate. So, questions first. Amy, thank you very much. I'm sitting on my hands because I don't want to take up our time, but with some questions of my own. But anyways. Who wants to throw something out there? I'm a single screen guy, so I don't, between Ellen and I, hopefully we see a hand up for a question for Amy.
Looks like you might get to hit me with one, Frank.
Well,
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Jan from ICI. Thank you, Amy, for interesting presentation. I'm just have a question about what kind of influence the ICI in terms of funding, whether the funding agencies, for example, do meet with you or the ICI representative from the university to discuss the research priorities. And then I think it's one of the first steps to have the other stakeholders, such as families and persons with disabilities themselves, but first the donors and funding agency must be aware of the needs which is amongst those stakeholders.
Yeah, Jan, the way I would respond to that is it depends on who the funder is and what the funding source is. Some of our funding agencies actually open every few years up for public comment, what their research priorities should be. And so we try to seize those opportunities to influence like national plans or those kinds of things. The closer we get to local, the more likely it is that we are talking to our funders. In this country, typically, once a priority is published, our funding agencies, which are usually Department of Health and Human Services, US Department of Education, Department of State, they rarely will talk to you about any published request for proposals while it's in the process of being landed. So for example, I intentionally called one of our project officers recently to talk about something that was in the forecast, because he'll talk to me about something that's coming up that hasn't yet been published. So it's tricky, but we do try to engage. It's just rare that they would come to us to talk about funding priorities. That said, our Community Advisory Council has numerous state agency representatives on it. So we're not talking about specific funded projects they're looking for, but they're hearing about what we're doing and they're seeing how we do it through that community advisory group that we meet with monthly.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
Tracy?
Yeah, Amy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, when you were talking before about the IRB and getting approvals for people with disabilities to participate. I mean, it seems like over time, maybe that's shifted a little bit, but I don't want to make assumptions. I mean, is it something that you're constantly having to kind of work through IRB and struggle with IRB, or do you feel like you've kind of, through some partnership, kind of created a pathway for them to understand the research that you're doing and the protections that you guys, build in?
I would say it's episodic, and it really depends on who's reviewing and what kind of review it is. We have done things like offer training to their staff around intellectual and developmental disabilities, around various types of guardianship. So it's constantly episodic. How's that? I don't think a year goes by where there's not a problem. And usually it's around assumptions that are made and not understanding the reality of life as an adult with an intellectual disability and how difficult that is. And it's really easy then to just say, well, only people who have guardians can participate, but that's not right either. So I think it's just going to be an ongoing episodic challenge.
Well, I'm at a choice point. I'm going to thank you, Amy, rather than eat into everybody else's time or Ann's time and keep us on track instead of digressing. Any last quick question for Amy? I would tell you, and I like our format here, just my comment then. What part of my question was going to be, I was feeling overwhelmed partway through it as a single PI with in a sense, without the resources or the deep infrastructure of an institute or center. I was trying to think of where I'm falling behind on all of the marks you laid out, and what is a single PI to do in terms of your advice for a next step. But with that as a frame, this combination of talks is what Amy said. She's presenting an institutional perspective on their approach to fostering and deepening authentic partnerships with respect to equity and research ethics. And I think from Ann, we will get that individual investigator over a long time scale of what it looks like to be in a long-standing partnership centered around a number of these issues. So with that, Ann, I'll stop. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
I'll have to unmute before I share my screen. Okay. Okay, do you see my screen and hear me now? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to share a little bit of a different perspective and journey. However, I think the themes are strikingly similar to what we've just heard. And I'm going to just share a few highlights of the kind of research I've been engaged in with partners addressing the issue of homelessness in children and families. And I'm going to start things off and then ask one of my longstanding partners representing the People Serving People organization to reflect as well on some of these issues. Okay. I can't. I'm trying to advance my slides and not being able to. Oh, there we go. I think that did it. My research on homelessness got started because the Wilder Foundation, where I was doing some volunteer work, requested that I look into the situation of homelessness in children and families in Minnesota, because that Wilder Foundation was very interested in strategic planning and developing programming for these families, but they knew little about the situation. And so on their behalf, I started to visit with shelter providers and school districts and also the literature to see what I could learn. And what I learned is that there was no information available, and many of the folks who were concerned about the problem of homelessness in the Twin Cities and across Minnesota needed information. So that experience inspired me to begin a research program focused on trying to understand both risk and resilience in children and families experiencing homelessness, with the idea and goal of informing all of the people who were trying to provide support for these families and address the problem of homelessness. And this picture here is a picture of the early research team. It was a very diverse group. And I think that was very important for the work that we did. And on the bottom right is Bill Price. He was both a PhD student at the university, but he was also a principal of an elementary school in Minneapolis. And having that kind of person involved in projects like this really provided insights to everybody in two directions. Homelessness began to explode all over the country in the 1980s. So our work was motivated by the Wilder Foundation, and they began to document the problem of homelessness in Minnesota, and they've continued to do that over the years. And beginning in the mid-80s, the problem rose steeply in Minnesota. And then the school districts began to keep track of homelessness very carefully, because that became a requirement of the federal government. And data from Minnesota Department of Education documents the rising problem of student homelessness in Minnesota schools. These data, that there's homeless students all over the state, but there's also a particular concentration in the Twin Cities because we have a large population of families living in poverty and very limited housing opportunities. And one of the most striking things we know and knew from the beginning about homelessness in Minnesota and all over the country is the disproportionality. There are huge equity issues. In Minnesota, homelessness disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic students, as well as other folks in the state. And that issue presents important questions and issues for all of us trying to address this kind of disparity, and particularly achievement disparities in our schools as well. So over the years, our team was involved in many different kinds of research. Sometimes we've done studies located in shelters and had research offices situated, generously offered by our partners in the context of emergency shelters. But we've also collaborated with schools and school districts, their research departments. And in recent years, we've also collaborated with MinLink, which is this fantastic resource at the University of Minnesota that makes it possible to integrate administrative data from different state systems in order to do research, that it can be integrated and then de-identified for researchers to conduct important studies. And through all of this process, we have learned a lot about engagement. I want to just highlight a few things we've learned from the research itself. Homelessness indicates a very high cumulative risk. And people who are experiencing homelessness often have a whole array of adverse childhood experiences. Both the adults in their history and the children in their little brief lives have often experienced a great deal of risk. And as risk factors pile up in the lives of these families and their children, you see more problems, not just behavior problems as shown in this graph, but also you see problems in physical health and in academic achievement. But that's not the whole story, because there's a lot of variation. And even in very high risk families and children, you see amazing resilience. And you see kids who are in this dire situation with effective parents who are doing well in school and so forth. And I think this research we did with Minneapolis Public School administrative data and our partners in the research department illustrates this kind of finding. This is a graph that shows risk. These are the reading scores over time, longitudinal data, pooling everything, all the data that they had on all the students tested in Minneapolis. From grade 3 to grade 8, they used the same test. So you could plot growth in reading achievement. And what this graph shows is different groups and how their reading achievement changed over time. And the children at the bottom are the children who've experienced homelessness at any point during this research project. And a large percentage of the kids in Minneapolis have experienced homelessness. Even the school board was shocked by how large these numbers are. When you add them up, 14% of all the students tested in that window of time had experienced homelessness. And they have much lower achievement on average, even lower than the children who are qualified for free meals due to poverty, but have not experienced homelessness, and way lower than the national average on this test, and children who are at lower risk in the same school district. But again, that's not the whole story. If you look at that bottom group of people who've experienced homelessness, these children show tremendous variation individually in their achievement. And here, this is one of these spaghetti plots where you can't really tell one individual from another, but close to half of the children who have experienced homelessness are doing okay. They're average or better in reading and math. And these kind of data beg the question, well, what makes a difference? We need to know what makes a difference in order to really inform our planning and programs to try to foster achievement even before we can end homelessness, which has proven to be an intractable problem. We learned that lots about protective factors, and we're particularly interested in protective factors that make a difference, that are malleable. And one of the most important protective factors for children, of course, is parenting, and the capacity of parents, even in very difficult situations, to pay attention to the education of their children and to be very effective in their parenting. And our data, we've repeatedly shown that there are many effective parents who are staying in emergency shelters, and with good parenting, children do substantially better in multiple ways. We also have learned that school readiness really matters, that The skills kids have to head into school matter. We've been particularly interested in executive function skills. Those are the cognitive self-regulation skills you're all using to listen to this presentation, but they're very important for entering kindergarten and doing well in school. Kids have to be able to pay attention and listen to the teacher and so forth. And we've been very interested in documenting and screening for these skills because they're malleable. And early childhood programming, attending quality early childhood programs makes a difference in school readiness. And we have tried to get that message out and develop interventions that work with the children that are staying in shelters. Recently, we've been involved in a Grand Challenge project that is funded by the University of Minnesota, focused around the issue of ending student homelessness. Our group is called Homework Starts with Home Research Partnership. We've teamed up with folks from state agencies. It's co-directed by myself, Maria Handretti, and the Deputy Director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness for Minnesota, Eric Rumdahl. And we've collaborated with MinLink, this amazing platform for integrating data, to do experimental research to try to inform the state about the impact of their programs to try to reduce housing instability in families and students. And we're evaluating their rental assistance program for students and their families. But all of this work has led to a lot of reflection over the years about engagement. And I just wanted to highlight a few things about the views we've come away with about deep engagement. At the top of that list is investing time. It's committing to engage and to stay the course. It takes time to develop trust, and it's important to form partnerships that are multifaceted and that endure over time. We believe in collaborative design. It's important to sit down at the table with everybody involved and try to get not only ideas, but to get input and different perspectives about the work you're planning to do. We think of focus groups as consulting with our research partners, the participants that are going to be in our research, whether they're parents or they're teachers that we've often involved. Diverse research teams are critical, and you saw how diverse the initial team was. And we haven't actually had to seek that out. The topic has drawn diverse team members to our work. We do a lot of presenting, both for and with our partners, and also for policymakers. Just 2 weeks ago, one of our former PhDs, who's now a professor at Villanova, testified to the Minnesota legislative hearing on homelessness and expanding the rental assistance program to a younger group of children. She came back to give back, and I think that's important. We believe in capacity building. We've tried to play a role in training and program development, and you form bridges between schools and shelters and educators all over the state and the University of Minnesota. The teachers in our lab school at the Institute of Child Development have partnered to do training with the early childhood educators and people serving people, just as one example. We sometimes co-authorship when people are interested in that on publications. And our work has created a bridge, a kind of opportunity bridge for many of students, graduate and undergraduate students, as well as faculty, to be drawn into volunteering and service in a lot of the programs and organizations, many of which are NGOs that are concerned about student homelessness. And they've done a range of things, ranging from helping to plan special occasions and celebrations, but also to after school and summer tutoring and that sort of thing. And we take very seriously the responsibility to disseminate and reciprocate when you have these kinds of research partnerships. And I believe that when you have deep engagement, everyone benefits. The research benefits, the researchers benefit, the public benefits, and the participants in research benefit as well. I just want to close my little portion here by expressing my appreciation for the engagement of the families over the many years who participated and shared their knowledge, the partners who've been involved in collaborating, but also the funders who've supported this kind of work, the educators who've not only been involved as participants and partners in the research itself, but have applied the research as they've learned about their findings, the publishers and the media who've especially those who've spread the word in a very faithful way and tried to get the messaging accurate. And also we deeply appreciate the policymakers who've listened and took action on the basis of this kind of research. And I thought it would be most appropriate to close by turning this over to Rinal Ray, who's here from People Serving People. She's the CEO, and that People Serving People is our longest standing community partner involved in the research and translation and applications of the work we've done on homelessness. So Rinal, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you all for having me. Anne asked me to provide just like a brief reflection on the content that she shared today and just some of what I've heard. I just wanted to start off by sharing that we have at People Serving People over 50 community partners. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are the region's largest shelter for families experiencing homelessness. We're located in Hennepin County in Minneapolis, downtown, just a stone's throw away from the university. And last night we had over 260 people staying with us. And on average, about 2/3 of the folks staying with us are children with the age of at around the age of 6. So we are a very young community and population. And we are privileged to be able to provide shelter and meals and supportive services that support a whole family. But we can't do it all. So we've engaged with partners across the area to help us augment resources and services that we can make available to families. And one of our longest serving partners is the University of Minnesota and this research partnership with Dr. Masten. We also have on-site Minneapolis Public Schools and healthcare for the homeless. And one of the things that we've been thinking more and more and kind of leaning more into is around racial equity. How do we champion it? And how do we utilize authentic engagement to do that? And so when we think about authentic engagement, what that means to us is trust, relationship, and reciprocity. So some similar themes to what has been discussed this morning. And that we think about that with our families and how we are in relationship with the families that stay with us, but also with our partners, right? We want to be making sure that we're thinking about that in a holistic way. And so we have, it's fun to reflect on kind of what has happened over the last 30 or so years in the work that we've been able to do. So much of it came before I joined, but I see the impacts of this partnership with us today. So when Dr. Masten was talking about risk and resilience, that work led to the direct development of many of our programs and services, our early education spaces and our curriculum, and it informed the adoption of an organizational philosophy around trauma-informed care. So we didn't always provide early education on site. We work with babies as young as 6 weeks old and work with preschoolers, and then we support kids, school-age children as well. So the protective factors work that we learned about through the research informs our parent engagement approach, the ways that we work with parents and to support their parenting. And it also informs our whole family approach and the work that we're starting to do around cultivating belonging in our spaces as an additional protective factor. Around school readiness, our early childhood center here at the shelter and the one in the community, our Center of Excellence, is informed by social emotional development and helping kids who are experiencing housing instability be ready to enter kindergarten with all the tools that they need to be successful in it, and is a part of our long-term play on preventing the reoccurrence of homelessness for that child as they move into adulthood. And some of what we've learned through the research and the data around deep engagement, and that longitudinal deep engagement we've had has informed our work around systems change and the way that our systems contribute to the experience of homelessness. So that has been really wonderful for us as a provider, but also as an organization that supports families. What can our state be doing differently to support families in this experience? So there's many more ways that I can point to how the research has directly impacted our organization along the way. And indirectly, I'll just say that to an earlier conversation, it's allowed us to utilize the learnings to share with funders and to expand the narrative around people who experience homelessness and the reasons that homelessness exists itself. So we try to do that in terms of making sure that our families have the best opportunities as they move forward in their lives as well. I feel like I may be over my time, so I'll stop chatting. I'll stop talking now, but happy to answer any questions along with Dr. Masten.
Well, just quickly, thank you both. And you could listen to what you have to say for a long time. It's so important. So thank you, Ann. Thank you, Rinal. And we'll open it up for questions.
Well, people are thinking, I'd love to ask a question to Rinal on behalf of the group, which is, what do you appreciate most about the community partners that you've collaborated with over the years? And, over the years, we've gone to the huddles. People serving people have huddles for community partners to get together. But I just think your insights would be valuable as kind of from the side of a community partner. What do you appreciate the most? What's most important as you engage with your partners?
Mm-hmm. I think it's, part of why we have partners is because we can't do it all. And we know that there are folks with expertise and access to resources and experiences and positionality and identity that are going to be better positioned to work with our families. And so that recognition that it takes a whole community and a whole system to support our families has been really wonderful. And I think when we can learn alongside what our partners are learning and make sure that what our partners are learning gets directly back to our families, like that is what we want to be working towards and moving forward with. It gets back to that reciprocity, a relationship that's not extractive. People want to talk to families experiencing homelessness all the time and have our families retell their stories all the time. It is triggering. It can bring them back to a place that is not helpful for them. And we want to make sure that there is some mutual benefit and that the learning goes both ways.
Can I I'm going to jump in. I haven't seen anybody else put their hand up, so I'm going in before the session is over. And this could, for Amy, Ann, or Rinal, if you wanted to comment on it. I see many of the names in our session today, and for early career investigators at whatever stage, doctoral, postdoctoral, assistant professor, or related. I mean, and I don't mean it to be like the soundbite approach here, but in just thinking of what the three of you had to say in your comments, what would you advise? What kind of advice for an early career person where we're a research university, so everybody is thinking about, I need to establish or working on establishing my program of research. It's going to take a partnership, and then what's in my mind is what's going to make that authentic. And so, from an early career bit of advice, what would you say is the sort of important approach to that task of thinking about authentic, building that in right from the beginning of a program of work?
I'll jump in first.
Thank you.
One really important thing is approaching any potential community partnership first with humility. And a lot of times people from universities kind of come in with that expert And really, for most issues in our community, we are not the experts at all. And so coming in with humility and understanding what the organization's needs are and spending time building those relationships. I can't agree with Ann more about how much time it takes to build authentic relationships. And so doing that with one entity, one organization at a time, I think is probably a good first step, and approaching it with humility.
I'll just second that. The first word that came to mind for me as well in response to that question, Frank, was the word humility, but also, reaching out and connecting and getting acquainted. It takes a while to learn. I mean, going with an attitude of learning and trying to understand the questions that an organizational partner, whoever the partner is, also may have. I mean, authentic partnerships are built around, respect and relationships and, mutual learning and opportunities to learn from research in this case and apply it. So, getting started, it depends a bit on who the partners are and how to go about it, because sometimes there's a history of partnership that precedes you, and sometimes you're beginning a new partnership, and the approach is very different for those. But I do agree, it takes time and to develop the kind of relationships and partnerships and, a culture of research collaboration with a particular partner. But Rinal, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with both what Amy and Ann have shared. I also think that there's, folks in early career, I'm just recalling my own experiences. I felt like I knew my stuff and that I was the expert. And so that humility is really important in recognizing that for our families, that they are the experts in their own experience and in their own lives. And that they are really smart and savvy navigators of systems and in survival, and they have a ton to offer. So how do we, I have a 5-year-old, so how do we use our listening ears in our binocular eyes to open up that different capacity within ourselves, and to have a different positionality to be able to do that, and recognize it's all about the intersections and the interconnections. For me, that's what authentic engagement is about, is that somebody else's experience and the way that they move through the world will impact us, because any drop in the water has a ripple effect, and that leads to us eventually in some way or another. And so how do we enter that relationship thoughtfully?
I'd also like to add, those were wonderful comments from Rinal. Kind of putting on my university hat for a minute. It's important that university administrations and department heads and people who promote young people and fund them and so forth appreciate that the authentic partnerships and deeply engaged research does take time. It takes time to build, and that we appreciate that kind of investment and support that kind of investment. And provide the opportunities and support of a research university and all of its aspects to engage in that kind of work. I see a huge change over the decades I've been at the University of Minnesota in appreciation of, this kind of research and its importance and the time it takes and the support for it. And so I see real progress in making it possible for young people, young faculty, and other young folks who want to get involved in this kind of work to get off to a good start and to sustain it and to feel appreciated for their work.
Frank, this is Amy. One last word that I would use, and that's service. And I think, Ann, you mentioned volunteerism, and there are lots of ways that we can provide service to organizations. Start with that and help, that really helps to build the trusting relationship. So when you enter an organization because you're a researcher and want something from them is very different than if you're interested in their mission and you're there to help service their mission.
Yeah, those are very important perspectives and pearls of wisdom. I appreciate that. Well, I'm mindful of time. I know people live in maybe Zoom or maybe you're on campus or wherever you are in person and need to move on to another meeting or whatever your day brings. So I think we'll draw this session to a close. Amy, Ann, and Rinal, that was a bonus situation there. So thank you so much for joining us. I think the great thing about Zoom is we put this together and people can get in and get out quickly in the sense of show up and in terms of how committed. My sense is if we had another half hour, we're in person and we're around a conference table, this is a continuing conversation. So hopefully for many of you, this has sparked and supported your own inclinations with respect to fostering and building authentic relationships as you pursue deepening your commitments in engagement and equity in your own research pursuits. So again, with that, thank you, Amy, Ann, and Rinal, and for everybody for joining us, and have a good day with the rest of your day. Bye-bye.